All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we leave today, I do have your second paper to hand out. And as we had mentioned, FG just stands for Forgotten Genius. And that's what you have with the, if you want to call it a guide of some sort. So, and we try to, at the end of every day, kind of go over and say, okay, so this was what we're looking for like the first one. PJ is Percy Julian, okay, was originally working for what type of company, and then making substances and synthesizing them is called what. And we'll go over that at the end of every day, but if you catch it on the first time through, it's probably going to stick with you a little bit longer. And it's not unique just to this year. We've done it 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year. So it's something that it's a program from public broadcasting that I think really helps supplement how we arrived on what organic chemistry and biochemistry essentially is. Because one of the aspects we talked about in class was if you have bad, I wouldn't say bad joints or sore joints, there's a steroid that you can have injected in there, and we all know that it is cortisone. And they talk about that, I believe, in this video. It used to be that it was not commercially available. And then, again, through the course of this video, we'll go through and pick apart some of these questions as we go. Yes. Okay. So away we go. And then, again, we usually stop at maybe around a little after 9 and go over any questions you might have. And I'm not sure we'll even get through this video this week. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get started here, and that will take us to the end of the day. So again, thanks to public broadcasting, we're able to do this. As you guessed, it's an educational documentary. Away we go.
Scientists are traditionally poor speakers because they have a hard time letting go of their gobbledygook. Ladybird, ladybird, fly away home becomes impossible when you must call the ladybird coccinella bipunctata.
Despite his growing stature at Howard, Julian was still determined to earn his Ph.D. In 1929, he finally got his chance. He won a fellowship that allowed him to take a leave from Howard to study at the University of Vienna in Austria. He was about to begin a lifelong inquiry into the chemistry of plants.
For thousands of years, long before there was such a thing as the science of chemistry, people were fascinated by plants because they knew that plants contained substances that could affect people. I mean, coffee will keep you awake. Tobacco contains something that will calm your nerves. Foxglove contains an extract that'll affect your heart. And the whole goal of chemistry in the early part of the 20th century was to understand what these natural products were, to characterize their chemical structures, and figure out how to make them. This was called natural products chemistry. It was the main branch of chemistry. And in 1929, Vienna, in Austria, was the seat of natural products chemistry. And that's why Percy Julian went there.
Julian arrived at Vienna's Chemische Institute with huge crates of ground glassware, items the Viennese students had heard about but never seen.
The unpacking became a big ceremony surrounded by fellow students who oohed and awed about the wonders that came out of these crates.
Among the onlookers was Josef Pickel, a chemist who would become one of Julian's closest friends and collaborators. They had come to Vienna to study under the renowned scientist Ernst Spate. Spate was a giant in the field of natural products chemistry. He had a particular interest in a family of compounds called alkaloids.
Of all the natural products, the ones that fascinated people the most were the alkaloids, because they seemed the most powerful. A thimbleful of some alkaloids would bring down an elephant.
It's believed that many alkaloids evolved to protect plants from organisms that might eat or harm them. But these same compounds can have unexpected effects on people.
We now know, for example, that it's an alkaloid caffeine that's responsible for the stimulant effect of coffee beans. We also know that it's an alkaloid called nicotine that's the calming influence in tobacco plants. Other alkaloids are things like morphine, strychnine, cocaine. A whole host of things that we now know are drugs turn out to be plant alkaloids.
By 1929, it was known that an alkaloid from the root of a common Austrian shrub called Corydalus cava was effective in treating pain and heart palpitations. Spate asked Julian to find out why.
And so the question was, which compound, which precise compound in this tuber is responsible for the biological effect that one is seeing?
Isolate the active ingredient in Corydalus cava and then identify its chemical structure. This was the challenge Julian would have to meet to earn his PhD. Free at last of teaching and administrative duties, he threw himself into his research as never before.
For the first time in my life, I represent a creating, alive, and wide-awake chemist. I recognize that publications and research will be for me as natural a thing as going to bed and eating a meal. Truly, I was the luckiest guy in all the world to land here.
Just outside the laboratory was a vibrant world Julian was eager to explore. A fellow student, Edwin Mosetic, took the American under his wing. Soon, Julian was joining the Mosetic family for ski trips, swims in the Danube, and the opera.
The mother of Edwin Mosetic was a famous musician, and the Mosetic house was a center for social activity. So in that way, Percy got access to layers of the society that were inaccessible in America. Black persons in Europe were very rare, and Percy, for the first time in his life, fully unfolded because he was admired there.
In letter after letter, he described his busy social life to colleagues back at Howard.
And now a little news. I have the prettiest girl in Vienna. You have never gazed on such beauty. Monday night, we were in the opera and heard Beethoven's Fidelio. Nature makes its demands. So I've made a date with my little German sweetheart when they talked of beautiful Viennese women. Sweetest wine cellar you ever saw. And drank till 3 a.m.
But at 7:55 each morning, Julian was back in the laboratory, working under the watchful eye of a man so severe he would immediately fail a student he considered lazy or untalented. The pressure was mounting on Julian to isolate the elusive alkaloids on which his dissertation depended.
The last 2 months, I have passed through a hellish siege of work. Reaction upon reaction. And yet I stand at the door and knock, as it were. I don't know a damn thing.
The alkaloids that puzzled Julian, like most of the molecules of life, are made primarily of carbon.
Carbon is really the superglue of the chemical world, in the sense that carbon can bond to itself in almost an infinite number of ways.
In this model, for instance, I can make a chain of carbons that continues practically infinitely. However, it can also come together into a ring structure. In this case, a 6-carbon ring structure.
The carbon ring is one of nature's fundamental building blocks, found in an endless variety of compounds. Members of the alkaloid family all have one or more nitrogen atoms, but otherwise their structures vary widely, which presented Julian with a formidable challenge.
He was working in some very difficult chemistry. When you don't know anything about what the structure is of the material you're isolating, you have to tear your molecule apart atom by atom and try to deduce the structure.
It's like finding a needle in a haystack. It requires stubbornness. It requires focus. It requires repeating over and over the same kinds of processes until the answers come out.
Slowly, the answers did come. In his second year, Julian finally identified the active alkaloid in Corydalus cava, his first chemical triumph. This work with Spate would be the foundation of his future career.
When Ernst Spate was asked about his student, Percy Julian, he characterized him and said, "Ein außerordentlicher Student, wie ich ihn in meiner Laufbahn noch nie gehabt habe. An extraordinary student, the likes I have never had before in my career as a teacher."
Julian returned to America in the fall of 1931 with the doctorate he had pursued for more than a decade. The years in Vienna had dramatically increased his self-confidence, but they had also sown the seeds of a personal catastrophe that awaited him at Howard. Back in Washington, Julian set out to turn Howard into a center for true chemical research, something his predecessor had been unable to do. Burdened with teaching responsibilities, St. Elmo Brady had not published a single research paper in the 15 years since earning his PhD. Julian was determined this would not happen to him.
I am going to give every damned ounce of my energy towards plans to flood the chemical market with as much research as the days, hours, and my strength will allow.
He brought Josef Pickel over from Vienna, and the two went straight to work on a series of papers. When their first was accepted for publication, Julian proudly noted it was the first with a black chemist as senior author. Percy Julian was now America's preeminent black chemist, and at Howard, one of President Mordecai Johnson's rising stars. But Johnson had made many enemies in his 5 years at Howard. Soon, Julian would be caught up in university politics with disastrous results. The trouble began when Julian, at the president's request, goaded a white chemist named Jacob Chauhan into resigning. Chauhan retaliated by releasing to the local black press the letters Julian had written to him from Vienna.
Weird, exotic.
Julian's accounts of his romances, his criticism of faculty members, suddenly it was all public. Ammunition to be used against Julian and Johnson by the president's enemies.
I had the prettiest girl in Vienna. Nature makes it stunning.
Just as Julian's letters began to appear in the press, there was another bombshell. His laboratory assistant, Robert Thompson, charged he had found his wife and Julian together. Lawsuits flew between Julian and Thompson. When Thompson was fired for going public with his charges, he released the letters that Julian had written to him from Vienna.
And drank till 3 a.m. Edwin and I were all stewed in the girls'
Through the summer of 1932, the Baltimore Afro-American published letter after letter from the man the newspaper dubbed Howard's prize letter writer. Finally, under pressure from Johnson and the Board of Trustees, Julian resigned. It was the middle of the Great Depression. Julian was a chemist without a laboratory, a black man without a job. Only a year after his triumphant return from Vienna, the career he had worked so hard to build was in ruins. When all seemed lost, Julian's mentor, William Blanchard, threw him a lifeline, bringing him back to DePaul as a research fellow to supervise lab sections. It was a big step down from full professor and department chairman, but he had a lab again, and his research partner, Joseph Pickel, would join him at DePaul.
In much of my life, I've had to pick up the broken fragments of chance and turn them into opportunity.
Over the next 3 years, 11 of the student projects Julian supervised would lead to papers in the Journal of the American Chemical Society.
11 undergraduate papers published in JACS out of a student body of that size was not only unusual for the 1930s, it would be unusual now. Julian took the talent in those students and put that institution on the map for undergraduate research.
DePaul's newest instructor left a powerful impression on undergraduate Ray Dawson.
He put on a grand show. He would come into his lectures in his white lab jacket with a flourish. He was oratorical in a way that some great scientist from London or Berlin might be. It was just a show, but a very good one.
Julian had finally found fulfillment, a place where he could teach and research. But when the local American Legion assailed the school for hiring a Negro who had been dismissed from Howard University, Julian was forced to stop teaching. He could stay on as long as his research grant lasted, but his days at DePaul were numbered. Everything he'd worked for was about to collapse again.
I decided I had to do things that would make people take more notice of me.
What he did was take on a high-stakes research project, one that would either make him or break him.
It all began with a simple little bean, the Calabar bean. It was a beautiful purple bean when I first got it. But it is not only beautiful in its appearance, but also in the laboratory it has within it.
Chemists had been fascinated by the Calabar bean ever since British missionaries brought it back from Africa in the mid-1800s. From the bean, they had isolated an alkaloid called physostigmine, used to treat glaucoma. But no one had been able to synthesize the complex molecule.
Synthesis is the process of making a natural product or some other substance artificially in the lab, one step at a time, from extremely simple building blocks.
Synthesis was the highest calling for a chemist in the 1930s. A successful synthesis could bring great medical benefits by making a scarce natural product more widely available. Just as important, it proved beyond a doubt that the chemist understood how the molecule was put together.
There were very few alkaloids that had been made from scratch in Julian's time. The synthesis of physostigmine would bring recognition to whoever achieved it. And that's what Percy Julian set out to do.
But Julian was not alone. At Oxford University, another chemist was at work on his own synthesis. His name was Robert Robinson.
Sir Robert Robinson was sort of the dean of organic chemists in England. He was a much respected creator of molecules, a trainer of many PhD students. He was the premier organic chemist of his time.
Moving step by step toward a final synthesis, Robinson had already published 9 papers on physostigmine in Britain's leading chemical journal.
It's a little bit of intimidation The world is supposed to know, I've got this domain, you stay out of it.
But to Julian, Robinson's approach seemed clumsy. Convinced there was a simpler way, he set out to beat the Englishman to the synthesis. A high-profile scientific victory would be just the thing to get his career back on track. But it wouldn't be easy. Physostigmine was unlike any molecule that had been synthesized before.
It bristled with spots around the molecule where methyl groups were hanging. That's a carbon with 3 hydrogens. There are actually 4 of these. And getting them in the right place is essential to making nature's molecule. It was a formidable chemical challenge for anybody to tackle in the early 1930s.
Julian tackled it the way all chemists do, one step at a time.
When you synthesize a molecule, you start with very small substances you can buy or that you know how to make already. You then start assembling those into fragments of the thing that you're hoping to make in the end. They're called intermediates. And what you're doing is you're following a particular path. This path takes you from the simple starting substances all the way to the final product, the natural product.
To build his molecule, Julian drew on a battery of techniques for manipulating atoms.
One can heat something to a very high temperature. That usually gets the atoms vibrating and makes new bonds possible. You can oxidize something, you can add oxygen to it. You can take oxygen out of a molecule, that's a reduction. We can expose it to pressure. Sometimes we can expose it to light to cajole the atoms to do what we want.
At each step, Julian had to verify that he'd actually made the compounds he intended to. For this, he relied on a device called a combustion train.
This technique takes an organic molecule which contains carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and burns it.
By weighing the resulting gases, Julian could tell what atoms were present and in what ratio.
How much carbon does it have? How much hydrogen does it have? How much nitrogen does it have? If your compound has the right ratio, you're a long way towards being sure you've made what you thought you made.
And then you repeat this process of purification and of analysis for each intermediate until you finally get to the natural product.
Julian was under tremendous pressure to complete the research, pressure compounded by events in his personal life. He was engaged. His fiancée was the woman who'd been at the center of the Howard scandal, the former wife of his laboratory assistant, Robert Thompson. Born Anna Roselle Johnson, she was a member of a prominent African-American family from Baltimore. She had graduated Phi Beta Kappa and was now working toward a PhD in sociology.
They'd already set, I believe, 2 wedding dates, which he had canceled. And she told him that this was the last time, unless he kept the new latest date, she would break off their engagement. And he was quite upset by this, but he had no choice but to proceed because we were only a few weeks away from the end.
In 1934, Julian and Pekel sent off their first paper on physostigmine, outlining a new approach to the synthesis. Julian attacked Robinson in the beginning lines of the paper.
To have a young upstart taking on the Pope of organic chemistry in England, naming him and coupling the words failure and embarrassing and low yield is almost unbelievably aggressive.
In many regards, that was a pivotal point in Julian's career. If he were wrong, he could effectively almost write off any research career at that point.
Working around the clock, Julian and Pekel synthesized a compound that was one step removed from physostigmine. Since that last step was already known, this would count as a complete synthesis. But before they could publish, Robinson struck again, with his own synthesis of the same compound.
He has destroyed me in one.
The race was over.
He's done it! The shock was almost unbearable. We were not the first, just the Me Too's. Why did he of so much fame, who did not all need the glory, have to snatch the prize from us? Suddenly my eye...
Okay. Stop there for today. That way, it gives us an opportunity to discuss what it is that we have observed so far. And as you're watching and listening to that, there's probably some aspects that, okay, I know what that means. I know what that means. And I hope that we can view that that's hopefully what's going to happen for you next year when, no offense, over there, next time that you see some of this content. Okay, I can never remember where to start this video, but the first one, he actually started working for the Glidden Paint Company. That's where Dr. Julian actually began. Okay, then this next one, when you're dealing with plants, okay, they're talking about, okay, caffeine. I don't know if it was Foxgrove, I think it was called. What was another one? Of course, tobacco, and then there was one more. When you take substances from plants and you make them for yourselves, and the next question, did you catch what that was? And I know this is difficult. That's why we go over it. It was natural products chemistry. That's right. So in this time frame, chemists wanted to replicate compounds called what? That was what was in the nicotine, the tobacco, the Foxgrove. It starts with an A. Those are called alkaloids. Okay? So then, what were some of the examples of these? Well, just like what we had talked about, I got Flaxgrove. I thought it was Foxgrove. So Flaxgrove, Flax, then I think it's glove, flax glove, okay? Tobacco, caffeine, okay? Those are what I have down. So that's, what are some examples of those alkaloids? Oh, I think morphine and cocaine, oddly enough, are alkaloids. And I don't know, I suppose you could say it's kind of sad that you can replicate that in one aspect or another. So what was the compound PJ needed to synthesize to gain notoriety from the calibarbine? It's really hard to say and spell. Physostigmine. And I think I've got it wrote down. I believe it's MINE. That's, since they have those nitrogen atoms on there, that's what makes that an amine group. Just like when we went through the amino acids, it has an NH2 group on there. Okay? So then they talked about there's 4 groups of these that surround that central atom, 4 methyl groups. Okay? So then to known substances, a chemist would add small fragments called what? And we've illustrated that before. And I think the best way to see that, and maybe you know what it was called already. Did you catch it by chance? It starts with an I. Be intermediates, okay? So what I mean by that when you're synthesizing something, okay, you begin with a substance that you already know exists. And in this case, and we've done that before, that would be benzene, okay? So we know that if you start with this, now you don't need to write this down because we have gone over this before. So if we know we have benzene, if we want to put an intermediate on there, we can't just do this, okay? There's something missing from this. We can't just take a methyl group and attach that on there. That too, okay? So in this case, I believe we could use, we'll just use aluminum chloride. There's something missing here though. And I know it was a long time, it was last semester. You also have to have a halogen on here, because since there's a hydrogen group on here already, that hydrogen grabs this chlorine, then that methyl group attaches on there. This is that process they're calling, you're adding an intermediate on there. And then that doesn't mean that you would stop there. You could continue on with that, and now you're adding some of that nitric acid. And of course, you have to have another catalyst here. I believe it was sulfuric acid. And then this directs where that NO2 group is going to attach. And this is what they're talking about by when you're building products, those are intermediates that you're putting on there. Okay, so then what is it? How can organic reactions take place? There were 4 examples. There's heat, there's light. Those were the first 2 catalysts we talked about. And then what would... You're so close. Like, if we have this acetone, we can turn that back to, those are the 2, oxidation and reduction. We can take this acetone and we can reduce that down to, now you have your isopropyl alcohol. Okay? So that's a reduction reaction, and the other one, of course, is oxidation. And then this was the funny looking deal that I suppose it has. And I'm thinking it's a piece of mercury, or that metal in there I think is mercury. Then it has a little recess in here, because as gases can collect in here, that tells you what ratio we have, and that was called the combustion train. I've never seen one before, but that's what it's referred to. Okay, so I'm going to pause this for just a moment. I was just discussing, trying to get around the Easter holiday. That's going to be a little tricky for some of this, because our first problem, which I did put your papers in there, the only issue that I saw was forgetting omega numbers. And I think then the increasing melting point, because what you'd want to start with is the polyunsaturated fatty acids have the lowest melting point, because it's actually below 0, then the unsaturated fatty acids, and then finally the saturated. That would be your increasing order. And then what type of acids have an omega number? Unsaturated. It could be polyunsaturated, but we won't go into that because I believe that would be a little more difficult to do. We could, but we will skip that. And then what is the opposite of esterification? Starts with an H. When you're adding water, yeah, you're breaking a compound apart because of water. That's why it's called hydrolysis. The opposite of that, for our purposes, was esterification. This first problem deals with hydrogenation, which would be pretty simple. We know how to do that because some compounds can't go through that process of hydrogenation. And then the back page, it all starts to deal with hormones, and we haven't quite got or made it far enough that I think that we'd want to pass this out to you. So I'm going to hold on to this for now. So we'll continue with, again, this forgotten genius tomorrow. And again, hopefully we can see, gosh, this is, of course, I'm going to find this interesting. Now, whether you students do or not, that could be a whole other question. And again, there's some things in here that, okay, some of this does sound familiar. Okay, we'll catch up to you next time.